The night before battle did not smell of steel, it smelled of flesh. The king's orders did not send his soldiers to the barracks or the chapel, they sent them to his wife's bed. The queen lay not as a partner, not even as a woman, but as the king's living seal of obedience. Every man who would fight for him first had to take part in the same silent violation. This was no pleasure, it was possession, a ritual designed to stain their loyalty with the same shame that chained her. They left her chamber carrying not courage, but the memory of their own complicity. And that was the king's genius. An oath could be broken, but disgrace cannot be undone. The palace air was always thick before a campaign, not with the scent of sharpened steel or the murmur of strategy, but with something heavier, more suffocating. In those hours before the army marched, the king did not meet his generals in the war room. He summoned his soldiers to the queen's chamber. The bed was no longer a place of union, it was a stage where the crown's most unholy command played. Out in silence, the queen, arrayed not in the glory of her station but in the naked weight of her obligation, became the living seal of loyalty. One by one the men entered, not as lovers, not even as men, but as instruments in a ritual of obedience. When they left, the king believed they carried something of his power within them, not courage, not blessing, but the unshakable memory of their own complicity. If you've made it this far into the shadows of history, help this channel grow. Like the video, subscribe for more dark true stories, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these buried truths alive. It was said this act bound them to him more tightly than any oath. He had rewritten the meaning of allegiance. It was no longer sworn with words, but carved into the flesh of shame. The court whispered of ancient superstitions, of kings who believed that dominance over the bodies of their subjects was a conduit to supernatural favor. But superstition alone could not explain it. The truth was colder. This was a weapon of control forged from humiliation, designed not to inspire loyalty but to make rebellion impossible. A man who carried such a secret would defend the crown with his life, if only to keep his silence intact. This ritual had not emerged from nowhere. It was the evolution of a mind that saw both wife and soldier as assets to be used, spent, and broken in service to the throne. The empire had swelled through conquest, but the king knew that armies could be bought, bribed, or turned. What could not be undone was the quiet corruption of honor. Once stripped of that, a soldier ceased to be a man in service. He became property, his dignity replaced by dependence. The king understood that shame is a chain far heavier than iron. It bends the back and stills the tongue. The queen's role in this was not born of desire or even duty as the court understood it. She had been groomed for political obedience, but no preparation could have readied her for the reality of her marriage. Every pre-battle night became an unending procession, each face a reminder that she belonged not to a husband, but to an empire's will. Her silence was not noble, it was survival. Words could be treason, and treason could mean a death designed to echo through history. Yet every act she endured became another thread in the king's tapestry of power, and another fracture in her own humanity. To the outside world, these nights were invisible. The soldiers never spoke, and the queen never broke, but the rituals seeped into the marrow of the army. Men fought harder, not from belief in the king's cause, but from the desperate need to keep their part in the ritual buried. They became guardians not of the realm, but of their own disgrace. And so the king's strategy worked. The battlefield became an extension of his bedchamber, and victory was won not through steel alone, but through the slow, corrosive binding of body and spirit. Each repetition of the rite deepened its hold. The younger soldiers arrived with fear in their eyes, the veterans with something emptier, the hollow gaze of men who had learned that survival in the king's service meant surrendering to his will completely. The ritual did not need to be spoken of in training, it was learned through rumor, reinforced by the quiet dread that passed between men in the barracks. In this way, the king's most private cruelty became the army's most public secret, an unrecorded law etched in flesh rather than parchment. That is here, in this first act of our story, that the true horror reveals itself. The conquest was never only of foreign lands, but of the human soul. The king's wars began in the queen's chamber, where he stripped not just her dignity, but the honor of every man who passed through those doors. When the army marched at dawn, it did so beneath banners soaked in silence, carrying with them not only the weight of their weapons, but the invisible burden of what had been done before the first sword was ever drawn. Silence was the first lesson and the last inheritance. From the day her betrothal was sealed across a table of maps and treaties, her tutors corrected not only posture and grammar, but the movement of breath itself. She learned how to sit in a room so that power flowed around her without visibly touching her. She learned to speak without making sound smiles for consent, lowered lashes for disapproval, a stillness so complete that courtiers mistook discipline for peace. The royal household ordinances synced in a clerk's small, unloving hand, defined her by functions. To bear heirs, to sanctify oaths, to adorn victory. Nothing in those lines allotted speech. The palace trained her to perfection and called it virtue, but perfection here meant disappearance. Ceremony perfected the disappearance. Every hour of the queen's public life was braided into liturgy, morning elevation, procession to chapel, audience beside the throne, the slow theatre of supper. The skin of the kingdom was this surface fabric, jewels unblinking graysan. She became its sheen. Chroniclers praised her serenity, noting how she never stumbled in the labyrinth of etiquette, how her hands remained steady when ambassadors measured alliances by a single cup of wine. The records are full of adjectives that speak of glass and water, never of weight or heat. At court, composure counted as evidence of moral order. Her stillness proved the king's. In truth, it proved only the efficiency of the cage. The private ordinances were more exact than the public ones. Her household was a fortress of surveillance disguised as care. Ladies assigned by rank and loyalty, ushers who counted footsteps, physicians who recorded cycles and losses in ledgers bound with the king's seal. Even prayer was regulated. Her confessor had been appointed by the council. Absolution came with instructions. Servants were punished for lingering at doors, but doors multiplied, each with a watcher. No letter reached her without being copied. No gift remained in her chamber without inventory. The palace called this protection. The law called it treason to subvert. She called it neither. She had no word that could safely be said. The ritual hollowed out whatever language might have remained. Before campaigns, when the army's banners were blessed in the square, the inner rooms prepared a different sacrament. The queen's body anointed, arranged, inspected by hands that belonged first to the crown, became the altar of obedience. Each entry was recorded nowhere and everywhere, written into faces, into the gait of men who had been made participants in their own degradation. The command was absolute and illegal all at once, which is why it worked. To speak of it would betray the king. To refuse would betray one's life. The ritual lived on the edge where law dissolves and fear takes its shape. In the aftermath, language died in degrees. The queen learned to split her gaze, one for the room, one for the space inside the skull where sensation could be folded and stored like a bloodied cloth. She learned to move so that breath did not betray tremor. The face became a polished mask, but not by magic. It was milled daily by necessity. A wrong flicker could summon reprisal reassignment of a lady, the sudden banishment of a childhood nurse, a public rebuke delivered as tender concern. She learned that compassion was the most efficient form of control. Those who cared, for her master of household, chamberlains, royal physicians, cared as wardens do, measuring survival, never life. The soldiers acquired their own fluency in quiet. They were trained to kill but not to confess, and the shame bound them to each other with a strength that surpassed oath or pay. Men who had never spoken in a chapel found themselves wordless in the field, compelled by an instinct that was not loyalty but self-preservation. In the barracks, their silence formed a second regiment, a brotherhood of those who knew the palace's secret and could never permit themselves the relief of telling. They fought as if the enemy carried not swords but ears. In victory, they drank quickly. In defeat, they slept little, even laughter thinned, wary of what it might loosen. The court interpreted this as discipline and wrote it into the king's legend. Victory proved the ritual, and the ritual proved the king's favor, so said bishops who had never been asked to bless what required no blessing. The queen's stillness became doctrine. Sumptuary codes extended to her breathing. Fabrics were assigned by the council to declare precisely how light should fall from her shoulders. The more elaborate the surface, the more crowded the depths. An empire can afford much ornament when it spends its truth in secret. There were women in her household who read the ledger of her skin more accurately than the ministers read their accounts. Midwives, laundresses, a nurse with hands permanently chapped by winter water. They knew time in stains and fevers, in the mathematics of loss. Their knowledge was the kind that cannot be published without becoming a crime. One learned to close a curtain so a trembling could complete itself unseen. Another learned to hum during dressing so that the smallest sound might be disguised. They risked nothing heroic, only the patience that keeps a body from becoming a wound. It is a form of loyalty the chronicles have no word for. The Queen's correspondence demonstrates how thought survives without speech. Pages preserved in foreign archives bear her cipher formal nothingness at the top, careful nothingness below. then sometimes a single phrase that means its opposite. I am in excellent health placed in a month when the physicians ordered broths and purges. The king is in good spirits written on a day when the household beatings reached the lower kitchens. Truth became a geometry of negation. The only safe sentence was one which refused to be itself. Historians later call this prudence. It is more anatomical than that, a muscle that clenches until it cannot tear. Time within the palace moved in circles, like liturgy, public devotions, private summons, feast, campaign, child conceived, child lost, confession regulated, penance prescribed. The repetition confers meaning in religion. Here it produced only endurance. The queen's body mapped the calendar more faithfully than any clock. There were months when hope quickened, and months when the court's smiles cut like salt. Every loss was recorded in an accounting that never balanced. A tally kept not in numbers but in dwindlings of appetite, of sleep, of color in the mouth, of air that reached the bottom of the lungs. What looked like calm was the sediment left by terror. The face that painters captured, a surface so perfect it reflected nothing, was not a lie, but neither was it the truth. It was the instrument that allowed truth to continue existing somewhere no one else could enter. The soldiers recognized it, their own faces wore less aversions. The king mistook it for submission because it produced the obedience he required. In reality, it produced a different creature entirely, a woman who could survive within a sentence stripped of nouns. The cage holds until the cage begins to echo. One echo is fatigue of ladies who cannot forgive themselves for what their hands must do, of officers who cannot drown the taste of the ant. Another is error, the protocol performed fractionally too late, the greeting pitched a degree too high. The smallest noise in a machine of silence announces change. The queen did not yet refuse. Refusal requires air, but the shape of refusal entered the palace precisely when the ritual began to require more of her than silence could pay. In that narrow corridor between breath withheld and breath demanded, history turned its face toward her, and waited. By the time the practice was no longer whispered about, it had already calcified into law. What had once been a private perversity became the silent axis upon which the machinery of the state turned. Military service was measured not in scars from the front, but in compliance with the most intimate decree the crown had ever issued. Victories could elevate a man, but true advancement required entry into the same chamber where loyalty was bought in flesh. Promotions no longer came from skill or valor. Land grants, command posts, and titles were now dispensed in the shadow of the bed. The king understood that steel could be forged in fire, but men were forged in shame. Every soldier who crossed the queen's threshold became an unwilling co-conspirator. In the sovereign's obsession, that shared stain was the most unbreakable bond, not of brotherhood, but of complicity. The king did not need to raise his voice to crush dissent. All he had to do was let the threat of truth breathe in the dark corners of the barracks. He turned his wife into a treasury. Her body was currency, and he minted loyalty in the heat of degradation. The queen became the coin no man could refuse, and no man could speak of. Her silence was purchased with fear, theirs with the knowledge that rebellion would mean not only death, but the public unsealing of the secret they carried. In this economy of flesh, there was no inflation, no market collapse. The value of shame only grew with time, tightening the noose around each participant's neck. Even the most decorated warriors were reduced beneath the weight of it. Men, who had charged enemy lines without blinking, now approached her chamber as though stepping into a tomb. The ritual had stripped war of its purity. There was no glory in spilling blood for a cause when the cause had already stripped you of your own dignity. The king had rewired the army's instincts. They did not fight for victory. They fought to keep their disgrace from following them home. The queen's chamber became a vault, its walls absorbing the confessions that could never be spoken aloud. Each visit deposited another measure of silence into the king's reserves of power. No oath, no document, no seal bore greater authority than what was buried there. The soldiers became his living archives, their memories a record he could withdraw at will. A rebellion could be extinguished before it began, not with steel, but with a single whispered reminder of what they had done. The system was elegant in its cruelty. A general who grew too ambitious could be reminded of the night he had been summoned, stripped not by the enemy but by his own sovereign's will. A young officer eager for promotion might find the path to rank paved not with strategy, but with submission. Each man's career, each man's honor, was mortgaged to the queen's silence, and she, in turn, was mortgaged to the king's paranoia. This was no longer a tradition rooted in superstition. It was a calculated ledger. The king kept accounts not in coin, but in compromised men. The battlefield became an afterthought. His true victories were won in the quiet, in the moments before dawn, when another soldier left her chamber knowing that his future depended not on his sword, but on his ability to keep that night buried. In this way, the crown rewrote the nature of loyalty itself. Allegiance was no longer sworn in the light of day, but bought in the shadows, paid for with the currency of flesh, and held in the iron vault of silence. By the time the soldiers marched to war, they were already conquered, and the king seated on a throne built from their disgrace, ruled over an empire that could not rise against him, for to do so would mean exposing the one truth they could never allow to be spoken. Night in the palace was never darker than on the eve of war. The outer courtyards throbbed with the rhythm of sharpening steel, the low hum of men preparing to meet death, but inside, the air was heavier, dense with the scent of oil and sweat, and something unspoken. The queen sat in stillness, the weight of the crown replaced by the weight of what was to come. The guards outside her chamber door did not look at her. They did not need to. They knew the order of the night. So did she. The first man entered before the moon had reached its height. There was no ceremony, no word exchanged. The ritual had long since been stripped of novelty, and with it, any pretense of human connection. What passed between them was not desire, nor even duty, as the court proclaimed. It was the king's will, rendered in flesh. The soldier left without looking back, his breath ragged, his eyes avoiding hers. He was not the first that night, and he would not be the last. If you've made it this far into the shadows of history, help this channel grow like the video. Subscribe for more dark true stories, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these buried truths alive. One by one they came, their bodies tense with the knowledge of what they must endure, their faces carved with a stoicism that bordered on fear. Outside these walls, they were warriors. Here they were, instruments in the king's private theater of control. Each departure left the chamber colder, the queen more hollow, the air more suffocating. There was no end until dawn, no pause between acts, only the relentless march of obedience. The king called it a blessing, the soldiers called it nothing at all. Yet in the barracks, when the night's silence settled like dust, they carried its memory as both a wound and a bond. They fought harder the next day, not out of devotion, but from the desperate need to drown the memory in blood and victory. On the battlefield, no man wanted to be the one who faltered, for failure would strip away the only shield they had against their own disgrace. For the queen, the night was a war without banners. Each touch was another blow she could not block, each face another ghost she would carry. There was no armor for this, no sword to end it. Her endurance was measured not in victories, but in the ability to meet each soldier's eyes without flinching, to hold her silence when every fiber of her being screamed to break it. By dawn, the corridors smelled of sweat and cold air. The last man left as the horns called the army to formation. Outside, the king's forces assembled, their armor gleaming in the early light. Inside the queen's chamber was a battlefield of its own, the sheets disheveled, the air stale. The queen seated in perfect stillness, her face unreadable. The soldiers marched with their heads high. The king watching from his balcony, secure in the belief that he had already won the first battle. For him, the night's ritual was not preparation for war, it was the war. By conquering them in the dark, he had made certain they would fight to the death in the light. The true victory was not measured in enemy casualties, but in the silence that followed, a silence so deep it could strangle the truth for generations. What had begun as a calculated act of domination became the king's daily sacrament. The ritual no longer waited for the shadow of war. It seeped into the calendar like rot into wood, staining even the seasons of peace. His need to summon soldiers to the queen's bed grew not from strategy, but from the hunger to feel his control renewed, proven, and enforced again and again. The palace guards learned that the call could come at any hour, not for battle orders, but for the silent procession that fed his craving for the king. The act had long outlived its original purpose. Victory on the battlefield was no longer enough. The true conquest was repetition, ensuring that no day passed without reaffirming his possession of both queen and army. Power, for him, was not a fortress to be defended, but a wound that needed constant reopening, proof that he alone could command loyalty through shame. Some chroniclers whispered that this was not merely politics, but the symptom of a deeper fracture, the fear of being forgotten, of fading into irrelevance without the constant pulse of submission beneath his hands. The queen's body became the ledger on which his paranoia was recorded. She shrank within herself, her voice thinning to the faintest thread, her movements slow as if weighed down by chains no one could see. Each summons stripped another layer of her will, leaving behind a figure that resembled the queen in form, but not in spirit. Her eyes no longer sought the horizon. They fixed on the ground, avoiding the gazes of those who entered her chamber. Every breath became a negotiation with herself to endure, to remain, to survive one more day of his obsession. The soldiers, too, felt the poison's reach. At first they had told themselves it was part of their service, a strange tradition, folded into the duties of war. But as the months passed, they began to see the pattern. Battles came and went, yet the ritual never ceased. In their silence, they shared the knowledge that they were no longer warriors tested by combat, but pawns measured by compliance. They lived under the unspoken truth that any refusal, any hint of defiance, would not only end their career, but mark them for ruin. Even the court learned to move around the king's hunger. Councils were delayed, audiences postponed, treaties ignored if the ritual demanded time. Advisors spoke in veiled terms of the king's private affairs, but no one dared name them aloud. Ministers who pressed too closely into his personal conduct found themselves suddenly exiled, their lands seized, their reputations shredded by whispers. The palace walls themselves seemed to absorb the fear, holding it in the echo of footsteps and the stillness of the air. The queen's deterioration became a kind of courtly spectacle, noticed but never addressed. Artists painted her as ethereal, draped in light, her expression serene, but in truth, she had been hollowed, her beauty a mask over exhaustion and grief. The women who served her spoke in guarded tones, tending to her without asking questions. They understood that every inquiry could be construed as treason. Her silence, once mistaken for dignity, was in fact the most brutal obedience of all. Now, the king's obsession no longer required provocation. It was not a means to secure loyalty, but an addiction to the ritual itself. Each night's performance was not enough. It had to be repeated, polished, perfected. The queen ceased to be a wife, a consort, or even a symbol. She became a reliquary of his need, a living vessel into which he poured his fears and drank his reassurance. His power was no longer about ruling the empire beyond the palace gates. It was about ruling the human will within them. In this stage of his reign, the most dangerous enemy he faced was not rebellion, invasion, or betrayal. It was the possibility of a day without the ritual, for in the absence of it, the illusions that bound him together would collapse, and with them, the empire he had built on silence, shame, and the slow erasure of a queen's soul. The first fractures appeared not in open rebellion, but in the hush of the corridors. Courtiers began to linger at doorways, listening for sounds that should not have been heard. Servants carried trays with hands that trembled, careful not to meet the queen's eyes. The ritual, once invisible outside the king's chosen circle, had begun to bleed into the palace's bloodstream. Foreign envoys, sharpened and hungry for weakness, returned to their courts with tales of a monarch whose command over his army was sealed not with honor, but with disgrace. Each whisper traveled faster than the king's soldiers could march. At first the king dismissed the murmurs as the natural envy of rivals, but when soldiers began to present themselves less frequently for the summons, citing wounds that never bled, fevers without heat, injuries no physician could find, the mask of indifference cracked. The very shame he had cultivated as a chain was now corroding their will to serve. What had been a ritual of control had become a sentence too heavy to bear. In the barracks, men spoke in coded fragments, their words broken off at the sound of approaching footsteps. The silence he had once weaponized now concealed something else entirely, a spreading refusal. The king's answer was swift and merciless. A captain accused of feigning illness was stripped naked in the palace courtyard and flogged until his back was a lattice of blood. Another officer was dragged to the execution block after a single night's absence from the queen's chambers, his head displayed as a warning to those who might think themselves exempt. Each act of punishment was designed to reassert the terror of his will, yet the effect was not renewal of obedience, but the deepening of the rot. Soldiers began to fight with the desperation of men cornered not by the enemy, but by their own ruler. The queen, by now, moved through the palace like a ghost bound to its walls. The rituals had thinned her body, but it was the executions that hollowed her gaze. She understood what the king did not, that every punishment turned the private shame of the ritual into a public wound. The soldiers' silence had once protected her as much as it had protected him. Now, their resentment made her an emblem of the humiliation they endured. She bore it without plea or protest, knowing that even the smallest act of rebellion would only hasten her destruction. Beyond the palace, nobles who had long tolerated the king's eccentricities began to speak in the language of opportunity. They saw in the unrest a chance to pry open the monarchy's grip. Rumors of alternative alliances circulated in candlelit chambers. Gold changed hands to secure the loyalty of officers who might one day be asked to choose between the crown and their own survival. The king's paranoia sharpened into suspicion, and suspicion into bloodshed. Ministers vanished between sunset and sunrise, their estates quietly absorbed into the royal domain. The walls of the palace, once the fortress of his power, had become the echo chamber of his decline. Where once there had been the steady rhythm of his control, a ritual performed, a loyalty secured, now there was only the uneven pulse of defiance and fear. His authority had fed on the secrecy of the ritual. Now, with its shadow exposed, it began to consume itself. The same shame that had bound his men to him was unbinding them, turning loyalty into loathing, obedience into a brittle mask worn only until the chance to remove it arrived. By the time the first swords would be raised against him, the rebellion would not begin with a shout on the battlefield, but with a single unanswered summons to the Queen's chamber, the quiet, final refusal that told the king his empire was already slipping away. It happened in full view of the court. No whispers in darkened corridors, no silent withdrawal into her chambers. The Queen's rebellion was a blade drawn in daylight. When the summons came, she stood in the hall of state, her body framed by the cold geometry of marble columns, and gave her answer, a single word, spoken without tremor, yet sharp enough to cut through the web of fear that had bound her for years. She would not prepare, she would not lie down for the king's ritual again. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar. Courtiers stared at the floor, terrified that even the act of meeting her gaze might link them to her defiance. The king did not rage, at least not then. His cruelty had always been most dangerous when tempered by calculation, and in that moment his mind was already crafting the punishment, not merely to crush her, but to strip her of the very substance of her existence. What came next was swift and surgical. Her name was struck from the day's records before the sun had set. That evening, palace servants carried her portraits into the courtyard and fed them to the fire, the flames snapping over the painted traces of her eyes, her mouth, her crown. Tapestries that bore her likeness were cut down and burned with the same precision as a condemned criminal's belongings. Her apartments were emptied, her jewels redistributed to women whose loyalty the king still trusted. The violence to her body was slower. She was not executed in a single blow, for that would have made her a martyr. Instead, her confinement was designed to decay her in stages. No visitors, no attendants save the guards who never spoke her name. Food was rationed to the edge of sustenance, the damp of her cell seeping into her bones until movement itself became pain. It was said her hair whitened within weeks, and her voice, once the measured tone of court diplomacy, shrank to a hoarse whisper from disuse. The message to the realm was clear. Disobedience would not only end a life, it would erase it, for future queens. Her fate was a lesson etched in absence, an empty seat at the king's side, a vanished figure in court processions, a name unspoken in ceremonies. Even the chronicles of the realm, so diligent in recording births, marriages, and alliances, carried no trace of her. In the official memory of the kingdom, she had never been. Yet history is rarely as obedient as a court scribe. In the kitchens, in the barracks, among the women who dressed the next queen, the story survived. Servants who had seen the firing, her eyes, when she refused, passed that image along in murmured recollections. Soldiers who once endured the ritual found in her defiance a shadow of their own unspoken hatred. And so, even as the king's archives rendered her invisible, the rumor of her final act grew into something more potent than the life. She had lived a legend sharpened by the knowledge that it had cost her everything. It was the paradox of power laid bare in seeking to obliterate her. The king ensured that her refusal would outlive him. For while names can be stricken from records, the memory of resistance, especially resistance born in the heart of the palace, moves like water through stone. It carves its own channels, invisible but enduring, until one day it breaks the surface again. And when it does, it carries with it not only the weight of her silence, but the echo of the one word that brought a kingdom to stillness. The queen's absence hollowed the ritual at its core. What had once been a chain of shame binding the king's soldiers to him became only an empty command, and an empty command inspires no fear. The men who once carried their silence like a hidden wound now spoke in low, dangerous tones. What began as murmurs behind barrack walls began to leak into the open, as though the queen's refusal had planted something in them, a seed of defiance that no decree could root out. Without the queen's body as the crown's weapon, the king's hold loosened. The soldiers knew that nothing could be used against them now. Their complicity could not be paraded. their disgrace no longer dangled as a threat. The web he had woven began to tear, strand by strand. Some defied orders outright, others obeyed in form but not in spirit. Their loyalty rotted from within. The king, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, turned to the only instrument he trusted more than the ritual. Naked violence, public floggings replaced private summons, and executions were staged with theatrical cruelty, designed to remind the realm who ruled its flesh and blood. But cruelty without the cloak of ceremony is a blunt instrument. Fear, once internalized through ritual, now had to be enforced with steel. And steel, unlike shame, can be met with steel. The nobility, long resentful of his dominance, began to stir. Foreign envoys, once cautious, now smelled weakness in the air. The court itself fractured, some still clinging to the king's favor, others quietly preparing for his fall. When the rebellion came, it did not arise with a single banner. It seeped into the palace like water through old stone, an uncoordinated flood of betrayals, refusals, and sudden absences. A general vanished on the eve of a campaign. A minister failed to return from a diplomatic mission. One by one, the scaffolding of his reign collapsed, not in grand battles, but in the quiet erosion of obedience. The king's final days were marked not by the sound of marching armies, but by the silence of an emptied court. His guards, once his enforcers, were the first to disappear. When his enemies finally entered the throne room, there was no defense, only a man who had once ruled through the bodies of others, now left with only his own, trembling and alone. New rulers moved quickly to bury the story. Official proclamations declared the rumors slander, the work of foreign propagandists. The queen's fate was not mentioned, nor the years of ritual that had bound the army in disgrace. Chroniclers were ordered to write the king's reign as a sequence of military victories and administrative reforms, with no trace of the bedchamber politics that had held it together. But memory is a slower thing to kill. Among the survivors, the truth endured in fragments: a soldier's bitter laugh, a servant's careful pause before naming the queen, a noble's sudden change of tone when the old king's reign was mentioned. These fragments passed like contraband, from mouth to mouth, surviving where ink had been forbidden. In time, the ritual became a shadow truth, one never spoken aloud in the halls of power, but one that stained the throne as surely as blood on silk. And though new kings would sit where he once ruled, there was always the faint scent of that old corruption lingering in the air, a reminder that the body can be made into a weapon, and that a kingdom's soul can be broken in the name of control. History did not write of it. Not in the gilded pages of royal archives, not in the triumphal accounts of conquest, not in the careful genealogies that bound one crown to another. Yet the ritual lived on, buried where only memory could reach. It survived in the trembling cadences of folk songs sung behind closed doors, in the bitter humor traded among veterans when the wine ran deep, and in the unblinking stares of those who had walked the palace corridors knowing what waited behind certain doors. It did not need ink to endure, it needed only the silence of the wounded. The queen's silence was the most enduring artifact of all. It outlasted her name, her likeness, even the place she had once held beside the throne. It became an unspoken law for every woman who followed that beauty could be a prison, that loyalty could be demanded in ways no ceremony would ever confess. Her refusal, though erased from record, lingered in shadowed glances between court ladies, in the guarded tones of mothers warning daughters of the dangers hidden in royal favor. The women of the court learned to read each other's silences as fluently as the king once read obedience. For the soldiers, the inheritance was different. Shame, once a private burden, became a lineage in itself. Fathers who had endured the ritual trained their sons for service with the same grim precision with which they once sharpened swords, but without the pride. They passed down the knowledge of how to stand without trembling, how to mask the eyes, how to carry the weight of what would never be spoken aloud. Even when the ritual was gone, its ghost remained, shaping the posture, the speech, the unyielding caution of those who served under the crown. The king's obsession, too, left its mark. It became a cautionary shadow in the stories of rulers told by foreign courts, a reminder that power which feeds on flesh will eventually consume itself. Yet these warnings were spoken only beyond the palace walls. Within them, the subject was as dangerous to name as it had been in his reign. In that silence lay the ritual's truest victory. It had taught not just obedience, but erasure. Generations later, the palace still stood, its stones repaired, its banners changed. But the true seat of power was not the throne room. It was the hush that fell when certain topics neared the tongue. It was the pause in a song, the tightening of a jaw, the slight shift in a gaze when old names were spoken. The walls did not. Remember, the people did. And so, the legacy of the unspoken did what no regime could erase. It kept the truth alive, not in history, but in the spaces history could never reach.